Sell the farm, old woman. They laughed when they said it. Not kindly, not playfully, but with the sharp, careless laughter of men who believed they had already won. Sell the farm, old woman, one of them called from the road, leaning out of the truck window. You can't keep it forever. The truck roared off in a cloud of dust, leaving silence behind. But the silence on this land was never empty. It listened. I stood on the porch long after they were gone. The wood beneath my feet had weathered 50 winters. The white paint had peeled in places. The barn roof sagged slightly on the western side. To strangers, it looked tired. To me, it was alive. This farm had buried my husband, raised my son, survived droughts, storms, and one year when the river nearly swallowed the fields whole. And now they wanted it. Not because they loved it. Because they saw numbers when they looked at soil. The offers had started 6 months ago. Polite letters at first. Development opportunities. Community expansion. A promising future. Then came the visits. Men in pressed shirts and polished boots walking my fields like they already owned them. Ma'am, this land could be worth triple in 2 years. Ma'am, maintenance alone must be exhausting. Ma'am, wouldn't you rather retire somewhere warm? They all spoke gently, but their eyes were hungry. I am 72 years old. My hands are stiff in the mornings. My back aches when I lift more than I should. But I have learned something in 7 decades. The land recognizes weakness, but it also recognizes loyalty. And I have never abandoned it. The real pressure began when the county announced the new highway project. The road would run just 2 miles east of my property. Suddenly, the developers weren't just interested. They were desperate. They bought the neighboring farms one by one. The Wilson place fell first. Then the Carters. Then old Mr. Haynes finally gave in when his medical bills stacked higher than his pride. Each sale tightened the circle around me. Until my farm stood alone. An island of stubbornness. 3 weeks ago, the power flickered twice during dinner. The next morning, a section of my fence had been cut clean through. Coincidence, they would say. Teenagers, maybe. But I have lived long enough to know the difference between mischief and message. They wanted me uneasy. They wanted me afraid. They wanted me to imagine what could happen to an old woman living alone at the edge of town. I did not call the police. I called my son. He lives 3 states away now. Works in an office with windows that don't open. Mom, he sighed when I told him about the fence. You don't have to prove anything. Sell it. Take the money. It's not about money, I said. Then what is it about? I looked out across the fields as the wind moved through the wheat like breath. It's about not being pushed. He was quiet. Just be careful, he said finally. I promised him I would. But I did not promise to sell. The laughter returned yesterday. 3 trucks this time. They didn't get out. They didn't have to. Their presence was loud enough. One of them rolled down his window. You're the last holdout, he called. You can't stop progress. I walked down the porch steps slowly. Progress. Such a clean word for erasure. You ever plant anything? I asked him. He blinked. What? You ever put something in the ground and waited months to see if it survives? He smirked. Lady, we build things that last. So do I replied. He drove off without another word. But they would be back. That evening, as the sun bled orange across the horizon, I walked the property line. I stopped at the old oak tree near the southern fence. My husband planted that tree the year we bought this place. Said it would outlive us both. He was right. Its roots run deep. Deeper than greed. Deeper than threat. Deeper than fear. I pressed my palm against its bark. I'm not done yet, I whispered. The wind answered. 2 days later, a black sedan pulled into my driveway. Not a truck. Not dusty. Not loud. Quiet. Intentional. A man stepped out wearing a suit too expensive for our town. Silver hair. Polished shoes. Calm expression. He did not smile. Mrs. Whitaker, he said. I represent Ridgeway Development. I believe you've received our offers. I have, I replied. And you've declined. Yes. He glanced toward the barn, the fields, the house. We're prepared to increase the offer significantly. I'm not interested. His expression did not change. You may want to reconsider, he said evenly. The county rezoning vote is next month. After that, your property taxes will likely increase. There it was. The real weapon. Not trucks. Not laughter. Paper. Numbers. Pressure. I've paid taxes on this land for 43 years, I said. I'll manage. He studied me carefully. You're making this harder than it needs to be. No, I replied. You are. For the first time, something flickered behind his eyes. Not anger. Calculation. You won't be the owner much longer, he said quietly. And then he left. That night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I opened the old wooden chest beneath my bed. Inside were documents, deeds, letters, and one sealed envelope my husband had insisted I keep safe. For when they come, he had said long ago. I never asked who they were. I think I always knew. I held the envelope in my hands for a long time. Then I set it back inside the chest. Not yet. The next morning, a sign appeared at the edge of my property. Not mine. A temporary survey marker. They were measuring, planning, imagining roads where my crops stood. I walked to the sign, pulled it out of the ground, and carried it back to the porch. Let them laugh. Let them threaten. Let them calculate. They didn't know something. Something important. Something that would change everything. They thought I was the last obstacle. They didn't know who the new buyer was. And neither did they. Not yet. The buyer no one expected. They thought I was alone. That was their first mistake. The second was assuming desperation looks like silence. Silence can also be preparation. The black sedan returned 3 days later. But this time, it didn't stop at my house. It parked at the edge of the field where the survey markers had reappeared overnight. Brighter, bolder, staked deeper into my soil like a claim. 2 men stepped out. The silver-haired representative from Ridgeway Development. And someone new. Younger. Early 40s, maybe. Navy suit. No tie. Eyes that didn't wander over the land with hunger. He wasn't measuring. He was observing. There's a difference. I watched from the porch, rocking slowly, as though I had nowhere better to be. They walked the fence line. Spoke in low tones. Pointed toward the highway construction in the distance. And then, to my surprise, the younger man looked directly at the house. At me. And instead of smirking, he nodded. Not mockingly. Respectfully. It unsettled me more than laughter ever had. An hour later, there was a knock on my door. Not pounding. Not aggressive. measured. When I opened it, the younger man stood alone. "Mrs. Whitaker?" he asked. "That depends who's asking." He gave a faint smile. "My name is Daniel Reyes. I'm not with Ridgway." "Not exactly." I folded my arms. "You were standing with them." "Yes," he said calmly. "But I'm not buying for them. I let that sit between us." "Then who are you buying for?" "For myself." He didn't try to step inside. Didn't try to charm me. Just stood there like a man who understood that thresholds mean something. "I grew up 10 miles from here," he continued. "My parents lost their land when the industrial park went up." That surprised me. The industrial park had swallowed good soil and spit out warehouses. "Your last name isn't local," I said. "It wasn't welcome back then," he replied. There was no bitterness in his voice. Just memory. "I've been watching what Ridgway's doing," he said. "Buying out every farm in the path of the highway." "And you want in on the profit?" I said sharply. "No," he answered. "I want to stop them." Now he had my attention. He explained it simply. Ridgway's plan depended on one thing: continuous acreage. Without my land, their development would split in half, commercially unviable. They needed me. Desperately. Daniel had been quietly purchasing minority stakes in the properties Ridgway already owned, through shell partnerships, private investments, and a holding company headquartered 2 states away. He wasn't fighting them with tractors. He was fighting them with contracts. "If I can secure your property," he said, "I gain controlling leverage over the development vote. The county can't rezone without a majority ownership petition." I narrowed my eyes. "You expect me to trust a stranger in a suit?" "No," he said honestly. "I expect you to read what I'm offering." He handed me a folder. Inside was not a purchase agreement. It was a partnership proposal. He wasn't asking to buy me out. He was asking to co-own. I sat at the kitchen table long after he left. The proposal was detailed. Legal protections airtight. The farm would remain agricultural, protected by conservation status. Profits from surrounding commercial development, if any, would fund soil restoration programs and local scholarships. My name would remain on the deed. My vote would remain binding. He wasn't buying my land. He was fortifying it. But trust is not planted in a single afternoon. I called my son. "This is risky," he said after I explained. "So is selling," I replied. "At least selling guarantees security." Security for whom? He didn't answer. Because we both knew. Security for him. Comfort for him. An easier future for him. But not necessarily the right one. That evening, the silver-haired Ridgway representative returned. Alone. His calm expression had cracked. "I understand you've been speaking with Mr. Reyes." "I speak with many people," I said. "He doesn't have the capital to sustain a bidding war." "I'm not bidding." His jaw tightened. "You're making an emotional decision." "No," I replied. "I'm making a long one." He stepped closer to the porch. "Do you understand what happens if you refuse to sell and partner with him?" "Enlighten me." "We challenge the zoning delay legally. We increase tax pressure. We make operations difficult." There it was again. Not a threat. A strategy. I leaned forward slightly. "Do you understand what happens if I sign with him?" His silence answered. 2 nights later, someone set fire to the dry grass near my western fence. It burned fast. Too fast to be accidental. I saw the smoke before I smelled it. Called the fire department myself. Stood with a garden hose long before they arrived. By the time the flames were contained, a blackened scar stretched 20 yards along the property line. The message was no longer subtle. Daniel came the next morning. He didn't say, "I'm sorry." He didn't say, "This is what I warned you about." He simply walked the burned earth with me. "They're escalating," he said quietly. "So am I replied. I went inside, retrieved the sealed envelope from beneath my bed, brought it back out. "This," I said, handing it to him, "is why my husband told me to wait." Inside was an original mineral rights survey, signed before the highway expansion was even a rumor. The land beneath my farm didn't just hold soil. It held water access, deep aquifer rights, unregistered in county planning documents, critical for large-scale development. Without access to that water source, Ridgeway's commercial expansion would stall. Daniel looked up slowly. "They don't know," he said. "No," I answered. "They don't." The next week, we filed the partnership. Quietly. Legally. Irrevocably. Ridgeway's lawyers received notice 3 days later. And for the first time since the trucks began circling, the road outside my house stayed empty. No laughter. No engines. No survey markers. Silence again. But this time, it wasn't theirs. It was ours. They thought I was a tired old woman clinging to memory. They didn't know I had been waiting. Waiting for the right buyer. Waiting for the right moment. Waiting for someone who understood that land isn't owned. It's protected. And now, the game had changed. Because Ridgeway wasn't negotiating with weakness anymore. They were negotiating with leverage. And they had no idea how deep my roots truly ran. The soil remembers. The morning after we filed the partnership papers, the sky felt different. Clearer. Not brighter. Just sharper. Like the air itself knew something had shifted beneath it. For the first time in months, I didn't wake to the low hum of engines idling at the edge of my property. No black sedans. No boots crunching gravel. No men pretending to admire what they intended to dismantle. Silence. But silence on farmland is never emptiness. It's listening. And the soil was listening. Daniel arrived before noon with a thermos of coffee and a rolled set of maps under his arm. He wasn't dressed like a developer that day. Jeans. Work boots. A plain flannel shirt. He looked less like a businessman and more like someone who had once known what dirt under his fingernails felt like. We spread the maps across my kitchen table. "These," he said, tapping the edges, "are Ridgeway's projected zoning corridors." Bright red lines sliced across neighboring fields like wounds. And one stubborn marriage. "Good," I said. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Panic makes corporations unpredictable. "I've outlasted droughts," I replied. "I can handle unpredictable." He didn't argue. 2 days later, the county planning board scheduled an emergency session. Funny how fast government moves when liability is involved. The hearing room was packed. Farmers, developers, local reporters, even a few people who had already sold their land and now sat stiffly in folding chairs, realizing the deal they'd signed might not be as final as they believed. Ridgeway's silver-haired representative sat at the front, jaw tight. Daniel and I took seats in the back. I wore the same navy dress I'd worn to my husband's funeral. Some battles deserve ceremony. When the aquifer survey was presented, the room shifted. You could feel it. like the air pulling inward. This documentation, the county attorney said carefully, indicates pre-existing mineral and water rights tied to the Whitaker property that were not disclosed during rezoning approval. Not disclosed. As if I had been hiding something malicious. I folded my hands calmly in my lap. Ridgway's lawyer stood quickly. This survey predates current environmental review standards. Which, the attorney replied evenly, does not invalidate its legal standing. Murmurs filled the room. The red corridor on the projected map, the one cutting through my land, now looked less like inevitability and more like oversight. Costly oversight. The vote was postponed. Development paused pending full environmental reassessment. Construction crews halted within 48 hours. The half-built overpass near the highway exit stood unfinished, skeletal and awkward, like a sentence interrupted mid-word. Ridgway stock dipped 3% by week's end. I didn't celebrate. Land teaches patience. Victory shouted too soon becomes vulnerability. But they didn't retreat quietly. 3 days after the hearing, the power to my barn went out. Not the house. Just the barn. The electrical cooperative swore there was no outage reported. Daniel checked the breaker box. Nothing wrong. By nightfall, the irrigation pumps had stalled. Fields don't wait politely for infrastructure disputes. They wither. Sabotage, he asked quietly. Pressure, I corrected. Pressure leaves room for deniability. Sabotage requires fingerprints. The next morning, I found the fence along the southern boundary cut clean through. Not broken. Cut. A message without words. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at the gap. Fear would have been easy. Anger even easier. But what I felt instead was clarity. They weren't attacking the land. They were trying to exhaust me. Make partnership feel heavier than surrender. They still believed I was the weakest link. They hadn't realized something important. I wasn't protecting the farm alone anymore. Daniel hired private surveyors to document every incident. We installed cameras, discreet but thorough. Legal notices were filed. Insurance alerted. Not retaliation. Documentation. Corporations fear paper trails more than protest signs. Then came the unexpected call. Mrs. Harper from across the creek. She had sold her acreage 6 months earlier. Her voice trembled. They're drilling test wells, she said. On what used to be my pasture. Test wells. Before environmental reassessment concluded. Ridgway wasn't waiting. They were gambling. If they could establish preliminary water extraction before the county froze permits completely, they might salvage their investment. I thanked her. Hung up. Looked at Daniel. They're desperate, he said. Desperate men make mistakes. We drove out to Harper's former land that afternoon. From the road you could see the temporary rig. Small. Mobile. Designed to look harmless. But drilling equipment doesn't whisper. It announces intention. Daniel took photos. Marked coordinates. Filed an injunction request that evening. By sunrise, county inspectors arrived unannounced. Operations ceased before noon. This time, the setback cost Ridgway more than 3%. Investors were asking questions. That night, my son called again. You're in the news, he said. I've been in this county 42 years. I've always been in the news. Mom, this is bigger. People are talking about you like you're leading something. I'm not leading. What are you doing then? I looked out the window toward the dark stretch of field glowing faintly under moonlight. I'm holding. There was a long pause. You could still sell, he said softly. I know. You'd never have to worry again. I don't worry now. He didn't understand. Worry comes from uncertainty. My certainty had never been clearer. The next morning, a letter arrived. Not from Ridgway. From a law firm in the city. A buyout offer. Triple the original price. Confidentiality clause included. Sell quietly. End the conflict. Walk away wealthy. I placed the letter in the fireplace. Watched it curl into ash. Money can replace comfort. It cannot replace ground. By the end of the week, something remarkable happened. 2 neighboring farmers, both of whom had signed preliminary sale agreements, requested legal reviews of their contracts. Then a third. Then a fourth. Daniel's quiet strategy was rippling outward. Ridgway's continuous acreage was fracturing. Not because of protest. Not because of outrage. Because of doubt. And doubt spreads faster than flame. Late Sunday afternoon, I walked the western field alone. The burn scar from the fire weeks ago had begun to green at the edges. Grass doesn't ask permission to return. It just does. I knelt. Pressed my palm into the soil. Cool. Steady. Unmoved by headlines or stock fluctuations. Land does not recognize corporate urgency. It measures time in seasons. And seasons favor endurance. When I stood, I noticed a truck parked at the road. Not black. Not sleek. Old. Familiar. Mr. Bennett from 3 farms down leaned against it. And this, he added, placing another document on top, is what happens if the aquifer rights become public record. The red lines stopped. Abruptly. My land wasn't just in their way anymore. It was their bottleneck. Once the county realizes they approved development plans without water access clearance, Daniel said, they'll freeze everything. And Ridgway. They'll panic. I poured coffee into 2 chipped mugs that had survived 3 decades. He raised a hand in greeting. Figured you might need an extra pair of eyes at night, he called. I've managed, I replied. He nodded. Still. Community's quieter when someone stands watch. He didn't say more. He didn't have to. Support doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it just parks by the gate. By the close of the month, Ridgway's expansion timeline had collapsed entirely. Pending investigations. Environmental audits. Contract disputes. Investor pressure. And at the center of it all, one farm. Still standing. Still planted. Still refusing. They had expected a quick acquisition. They found resistance instead. But resistance isn't what unsettled them most. It was the realization that I wasn't fighting alone anymore. The soil remembers who tends it. And it remembers who tries to strip it bare. And now the county was remembering too. That night, as wind moved through the corn like whispered applause, Daniel stood beside me on the porch. They underestimated you, he said. No, I replied. They underestimated time. He glanced toward the dark highway structure in the distance. What happens next? I rocked slowly in my chair. Listening. Waiting. Because battles aren't won when opponents retreat. They're won when opponents reveal how far they're willing to go. And something in the stillness told me. Ridgway wasn't finished. They were regrouping. And the next move wouldn't be paperwork. It would be personal. The night the ground answered. The first lawsuit arrived on a Tuesday. Hand-delivered. Stamped in heavy ink, as though weight alone could make it true. Ridgeway Development was suing for interference of commercial expectation and deliberate obstruction of municipal planning. Big words. Thin case. But lawsuits aren't always about winning. Sometimes they're about bleeding someone slowly. They assumed I would fold under legal pressure. They forgot something important. Pressure doesn't break stone. It reveals cracks in steel. Daniel arrived that afternoon with 2 attorneys. One specialized in land conservation law, the other in corporate governance. Neither looked worried. That unsettled me more than the fire had. "You expected this," I said. Daniel nodded. "I was counting on it." I stared at him. "Explain." He placed a new document on the kitchen table. Ridgeway's lawsuit forces disclosure. If they pursue rezoning through litigation, every asset and dependency tied to their development must be examined. Meaning they have to admit what they need from you. And that's when I understood. The aquifer. The water rights. The one thing they didn't know I had. Or thought I'd forgotten. 3 days later, county officials came to inspect the burned fence line. Not for the fire. For environmental compliance. Ridgeway had filed an anonymous complaint claiming my irrigation system was violating watershed protections. Petty. Transparent. Desperate. I walked the officials down the slope myself. Showed them the restored channels my husband built 20 years ago. The natural drainage routes. The soil integrity tests. They found nothing. Because there was nothing to find. When they left, one of them paused. "You know," he said quietly, "there's talk in the council about fast-tracking the highway annex." "Of course there is," I replied. "But without unified land signatures, it'll stall." I nodded once. "Good." That night, Daniel called. "They've accelerated," he said. "Private investors are getting nervous." "Good," I said again. But he didn't sound satisfied. "There's something else." I waited. "They've secured emergency financing." "For what?" "A compulsory acquisition challenge." My grip tightened on the phone. Eminent domain. They were considering it. Using public infrastructure expansion as justification to seize my land. I felt something inside me go still. Not fear. Calculation. "They can't," I said. "They can try." I didn't sleep that night. I walked the property instead. Lantern in hand. The air was colder than usual. The soil firm beneath my boots. I stopped near the old oak at the center of the lower field, the one my husband planted when our son was born. I pressed my palm against its trunk. "You told me to wait," I whispered into the dark. And the wind moved through the branches like an answer. The public notice appeared in the newspaper 2 mornings later. A proposal to evaluate strategic land use adjustments for infrastructure efficiency. That was the polite way of saying, "We may take what we want." Daniel arrived before I even called him. "They're bluffing," he said immediately. "Are they?" "Yes. Eminent domain requires public necessity. Retail complexes and logistics warehouses don't qualify unless they reclassify it." He exhaled. "Yes. And how do they reclassify it?" "Water." There it was again. The aquifer. If Ridgeway could prove the land was essential to regional water distribution for public expansion, they could argue necessity. "They don't know about the mineral rights," I said. Daniel's eyes darkened. "They don't need to." Silence filled the kitchen. Because if the county initiated an independent geological review, they would discover it. And once it became public record, the leverage shifted. Not just to Ridgway. To everyone. Corporations. Utility authorities. State agencies. My quiet advantage would become a spotlight. That afternoon, I made a decision. I called for a town meeting. Not formal. Not political. Just neighbors. Farmers. Families who hadn't sold yet. We gathered in the old Grange Hall. 32 people. Some wary. Some resigned. Some already defeated. I stood at the front. I won't tell you what to do, I began. Sell if you need to. Keep if you can. But understand this, Ridgway's not building a highway. They're building control. Murmurs. I continued. They need continuous land. They need water access. They need our signatures. Separate, we're easy. I let that settle. Together. I didn't finish the sentence. I didn't need to. Daniel stepped forward then. Calm. Clear. Precise. He explained the legal structure of a land cooperative. Shared voting rights. Conservation overlays. Collective resistance against forced acquisition. And then he said something that shifted the room. If they try eminent domain against one of you, they challenge all of you. That's when the fear began to turn into something else. By the end of the night, 17 families signed letters of intent. Not contracts. Intent. But intent matters. Intent builds walls. The county council meeting was scheduled for the following Monday. Ridgway representatives arrived confident, polished, prepared. They presented economic projections, job creation charts, infrastructure growth models. They spoke in percentages and inevitabilities. Then Daniel requested to speak. He didn't argue emotion. He argued dependency. He laid out ownership structures. Minority holdings, voting thresholds, environmental compliance obligations. And then he submitted something unexpected. A collective conservation filing. 17 adjoining properties, including mine, seeking preliminary agricultural preservation status, which, if approved, would freeze rezoning consideration during review. The council chamber went silent. Ridgway's attorney stood immediately. This is obstruction. Daniel replied evenly. This is participation. But the moment that changed everything didn't happen inside the chamber. It happened outside. As the meeting adjourned, a county geologist approached me. Older man. Steady eyes. I've reviewed your land surveys before, he said quietly. And you're sitting on a protected aquifer. My pulse slowed. I know. He studied me carefully. If this escalates, the state will intervene. I assumed. He hesitated. Are you prepared for that? I looked past him. At Ridgway's executives gathering in tight circles. At my neighbors standing closer together than they had in years. At Daniel, calm but watchful. Yes, I said. I am. That night, something shifted. The road stayed empty again. No trucks. No survey stakes. No threats. But I knew better than to mistake quiet for surrender. Ridgway had resources, influence, patience, and men who didn't like losing. But now, they weren't facing an old woman. They weren't facing a single farm. They weren't even facing a lawsuit. They were facing exposure. And corporations fear light more than fire. Near midnight, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I answered. A man's voice. Low. Controlled. You should have sold. I didn't ask who it was. Too late, I said. A pause. You don't understand what you've started. I smiled into the dark. Oh, I replied softly. I understand exactly. The line went dead. I stepped outside. The moon hung high over the fields. Wind moving through crops like a breath held too long. For the first time since Ridgway arrived, the ground didn't feel threatened. It felt awake. And somewhere beneath my boots, beneath the soil, beneath the roots, beneath the aquifer they were only beginning to sense, the farm was answering back. Not with noise, not with fire, but with something far more dangerous. Unity. The buyer at the table. They came at dawn. Not with trucks. Not with threats. With smiles. 3 black sedans rolled slowly up my gravel drive, stopping just short of the porch as if even the tires understood this wasn't their land. I was already outside, coffee in hand, waiting. The first man to step out wasn't one of the executives from the council meeting. This one wore no expensive suit, no polished arrogance. Just a tailored charcoal coat and the kind of quiet confidence that doesn't need to announce itself. Behind him, 2 others remained near the cars. Observers. He walked forward alone. Mrs. Carter, he said evenly. You've got the advantage of me, I replied. Leonard Vale. The name meant nothing. Which meant it probably should. He extended a hand. I didn't take it. He didn't seem offended. I represent an investment group with an interest in your property. I raised a brow. You and half the county. He smiled faintly. Not quite like this. Inside, I poured him coffee. Not because I trusted him. Because hospitality unsettles men who expect hostility. He took in the kitchen slowly.